Production and distribution of City Club forums on IdeaStream are made possible by the generous support of PNC and the Raskin Family Fund, with additional funding from Cleveland State University, Robert Conrad, and the Payne Fund.
Good afternoon, and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. My name is Alex Johnson, president of Cuyahoga Community College. Tri-C, as many of you know, is a proud partner of the City Club of Cleveland, and I'm excited this afternoon to introduce the next speaker in the City Club series on the value of water, sponsored by the Northeast Ohio Regional Sewer District. As they like to say, they keep our Great Lake great, and we're thankful. Before I present our speaker, I just want you to know that those of you who will be purchasing the book, he told me to remind you not to ask him to co-sign for his brother, because then he'll have to share half of the proceeds with him. Did I get it right? So it was an election 49 years ago that began what we are thinking about here today. The history of cost goes much further back to the dawn of the industries that fueled our city's early growth. But it was the election of Carl Stokes in 1967 that set an important course of Cleveland and the nation. That was a moment when Mayor Stokes and his brother, Congressman Louis Stokes, were able, with the help of many Clevelanders, to awaken national attention to the cause of environmental justice. As we will hear, the entire nation, perhaps the world, benefited from this. Next year will mark the 50th anniversary of the election of Carl Stokes. 50 years since voters first elected an African American to be the mayor of a major American city. That happened here in Cleveland. Starting in January, Tri-C's Jack, Joseph, and Morton Mandel Humanities Center, the City Club of Cleveland, the Cleveland Foundation, the Greater Cleveland Partnership, the Maltz Museum of Jewish Heritage, and the Western Reserve Historical Society will lead more than 60 partner organizations who are collaborating to present a year of programming honoring Mayor Stokes, Congressman Stokes, and the legacy of civil rights and human rights in Cleveland. And many of our partners are here today, and I'd like for them to stand and be recognized. All of our partners, our chairs, our co-chairs, our committee chairs, please stand. Thank you. I do hope that our distinguished students from St. Ignatius and all of the other high schools represented here today will take advantage of this opportunity to explore Cleveland's history as well. Already, we have the support of funders, including the Cleveland Foundation, the George Gunn Foundation, KeyCorp, the Medical Mutual, Eaton, the Cleveland Clinic, the Ohio Humanities Council, the Greater Cleveland Partnership, and we're also grateful to the support of the Stokes family and Brett Hammond, Louis Stokes' grandson, in attendance today. Brett, please stand and be recognized. Thank you. You favor your granddad, by the way. I know that, and you look like your dad, so the lineage is absolutely there. The commemoration will explore the policies enacted by the mayor and congressman in sustainability, housing, education, safety, jobs, and the economy and health care. We will determine their status today and prepare leadership to continue these efforts in the future. And finally, the year will end with a grand celebration honoring legendary leaders and the dedication of a permanent exhibit at the Cleveland History Center at the Western Reserve Historical Society. We're calling it Stokes, honoring the past, inspiring the future. And in many ways, today's program is a prologue to that series. It is also a reminder that every day we benefit from the legacy of Mayor Stokes. Our speaker today is Dr. David Stradling, who will not share the proceeds with his brother, who he happened to co-author the book with, entitled Where the River Burned, Carl Stokes and the Struggle to Save Cleveland. Many great programs come to the City Club because of members of our community. This one is no exception. City Club member Jerry Meyer brought Dr. Stradling to the attention of the staff here and helped make today his appearance possible. So thank you very much, Jerry. Where are you, Jerry? Dr. Stradling is currently Professor of History and Associate Dean of the Humanities at the University of Cincinnati. His focus is on urban environmental history and air pollution, including the struggle to improve air quality and the many ways in which urbanization has influenced rural America. He has authored several books, an environmental history of which Where the River Burned is the most recent. Our speaker previously taught at New Jersey Institute of Technology in Newark, New Jersey. Dr. Stradling received his Ph.D. from the University of Wisconsin-Madison after earning a Bachelor of Arts degree and a Master of Arts in Teaching from Colgate University. A native of Cincinnati, he shows his environmental commitment by commuting to campus on foot through the Burnett Wood. And how long is that?
About a mile.
Oh. When I was growing up, that's not the purpose of our conversation today. Not to compare the length of time that we walked to school. But I think it was more like 6 miles in the snow. And I lived in Miami. How's that? You're a good crowd. Or I'm a good warm-up act. Ladies and gentlemen, members and friends of the City Club of Cleveland, please give a strong City Club welcome to Dr. David Stradling.
Thank you. It's really an honor to be here. Thank you, Dr. Johnson. Thank you to Lauren Ohnke, who fed me last night, and we had a wonderful conversation, to Stephanie Jansky for making all of these arrangements and everybody else who played a role in it. I worked on this book for a number of years, and one day I was sitting in my office looking around, and I noticed that there were many empty cartons of Burning River Pale Ale sitting on my various bookshelves, and I realized that I better publish this thing in a hurry before people realized that I had a problem. So we did that, my brother and I, and it was really a lovely project because I got to come to Cleveland, which I hate to admit it, because one ought not when you're a historian and you're supposed to retain some objectivity, but I fell in love with this city, and I miss it. I don't get to come up here as often as I used to. In 1997, Adam Warbach, who was at the time the president of the Sierra Club, reflected back on the burning of the Cuyahoga River. I mean, it was a river lighting on fire. It was almost biblical. And it energized American action because people understood that that should not be happening. Right? It's a pretty straightforward statement about the problem. Right? You might remember Randy Newman's song, Burn On. In the liner notes of his compilation album of 1998, he writes, "I saw the Cuyahoga River on fire on television." The problem, of course, and many of you know this, is that he didn't see the Cuyahoga River on fire on television because it wasn't broadcast, it wasn't captured on film. Right? And this begins the first of our problems of the fable of the Cuyahoga River, is it's difficult to keep track of exactly what fire we're talking about and what that fire looked like. And most of you in the room probably already know that the fire that you're looking at here in this image is the fire from 1952. And I put it here largely because it appeared in Time magazine in 1969 as Time, the first national publication to draw attention to the Cuyahoga catching fire a couple of months after it had happened, decided to use this much more dramatic photograph of the 1952, which was a much worse fire, kind of cementing in the minds of lots of people that this was a remarkably dramatic and traumatic event, which in fact it was not. Here's the actual Cuyahoga River fire from June of 1969. This is the last of many fires on the river. You see the Anthony J. Calabrese, which you can still see down on the Cuyahoga. You'll notice that this is the damage from the fire. It is a railroad trestle that marks the end of navigation, still does the end of navigation on the Cuyahoga from the lake. And this is why the fire took place here, because the debris built up on the back. So the problem that we have is, how do we keep this actual fire in mind, this much smaller fire in mind? Jonathan Adler, who teaches law at Case Western, described the fable of the Cuyahoga and did so quite well. Much of the Cuyahoga story is mythology, a fable with powerful symbolic force. And this is absolutely true. It makes for a very powerful story. The environment was very polluted. It was in need of government regulation. The government passed the Clean Water Act, and the Clean Water Act worked. It's a very linear and powerful story, easily understood. And this is what mythology is all about. It's a simplification of the past that allows us to attribute some meaning to events. It's explanatory, right? And to some degree, we can hold on to that myth because it serves a political purpose. And this was Jonathan Adler's point, that in fact the purpose of it was to affirm the involvement of the federal government in regulation. And from his libertarian point of view, this is problematic. From my point of view, the problem is actually the other things that are missing from the story. In particular, Carl Stokes, who should be front and center, and this is what we realized as we were doing our research, front and center in any telling of the story of the fire. He had been in office for about 1.5 years when the Cuyahoga caught fire. And he took the opportunity, as he very often did, to walk through the city with the press on the day after the fire to make points, to drive home his conclusions about what the problem was on the Cuyahoga in general. So he did what I call the pollution tour. He gathers the press. They've been told to meet him at the railroad trestle, which you see here. That's Betty Cleric, by the way, that he's speaking to, who was one of the first environmental beat reporters in the United States. She worked for the Cleveland Press, a very important part of the story. And there he's talking about the problems of the Cuyahoga in a way that situates that particular fire in the context of the city. Right? And this is what historians want you to think about. It isn't just that one moment, right, of the river bursting into flames, but there's a broader context that we need to pay attention to, and this is what Carl was telling us. So the pollution tour sets the fire in this physical context. He goes to Harshaw Chemical and shows the press all of the colors that the river is turning. He visits a combined sewer overflow, as you see here, where the pollution is just simply dumping into the Cuyahoga River. He visits a broken intercept sewer, which had been dumping millions of gallons of sewage into the Cuyahoga since it had broken more than a month earlier. And his point in all of this was to note that Cleveland did not have control over the river that ran through its city. Right? He didn't have the ability to convince Cuyahoga Heights to connect its own sewers to the southerly treatment plant. He didn't have the authority to fix the intercept pipe that was broken, which was bogged down in a federal project to build what turned out to be 71. But there was another context, too. It wasn't just the immediate context of the river. It was the context of the city itself. The population, jobs, and tax base were all falling in Cleveland in 1969. Pollution, crime, and poverty were all rising. And he constantly made this assertion when he's talking about the environment. Stokes had the ability to connect all of these problems, right? He wasn't just connecting Cleveland to its neighbors when he talked about the way that the river worked, but he was connecting all of these problems together. So these are my 2 points. Carl Stokes is integral to this story because he convinces us of 2 things. One is that these problems are connected and that all of these places are connected by ecology. He really did have an ecological way of thinking about how these things are all connected. At the same time, he reminds us that the metropolitan region was divided by power, that he did not, as the mayor of Cleveland, have the power to draw the region together to solve its regional problems, whether they be pollution or poverty. Stokes made very little of the fire as when he was mayor, other than that particular pollution control. As my brother and I noted, nobody got fired because the river caught fire, and nobody got hired because the river caught fire. They already had their pollution control team in place by the time the river caught fire. They were already making progress. This wasn't seen as some grand calamity that somebody had to lose a job over. There was no reorganization within the city. In other words, we shouldn't think of it as this remarkable watershed for the city. And in fact, after Stokes' administration is over, and he writes a really powerful, if you want to read one book about the Stokes administration, you can read ours. If you want to read 2, you should read his own political autobiography, which is called Promises of Power, which is really actually one of the most remarkable books I've ever read from an American politician. He's incredibly blunt about everything, and he does not mention the Cuyahoga River fire, which I think is meaningful. What he did reveal, though, is that the city of Cleveland was engulfed in problems. And because of that, there was no particular reason to hold on to the imagery of this one little fire on the river. I'm going to shift gears a little bit and read to you a couple of letters that were sent to Carl Stokes on the first Earth Day. This is when I first realized that maybe the mythology of the river fire was more complete than I had imagined. I went off to the Western Reserve Historical Society, which has an amazing collection. The Stokes administration, I think, understood that it was a significant moment in American politics, and that historians like myself, and then I hope many, many others, would want to use the papers to see how the administration functioned. So it's really a treasure trove. And part of that treasure trove are hundreds of letters that were written to Mayor Stokes on the first Earth Day, which happened about 10 months after the Cuyahoga River fire. So you can imagine when I first realized that these letters were in the collection, that I was thinking, oh my gosh, all these kids, they're mostly letters from school kids, right? All of these kids will have mentioned the Cuyahoga River fire, and then I'll have all of this evidence about how meaningful this was to the city of Cleveland. And I kept flipping through and looking and looking and looking. Almost none of them mention the Cuyahoga River at all. And those that do often don't mention the fact that it had caught fire just 10 months earlier. What do you do with that? As a historian, first I scratched my head and went away rather dejected. I'm not a very good historian, apparently, because I did not realize that what it was telling me is that Cleveland had many other things on its mind. Even its school children had other things on their mind. I'm going to read you 2 letters from two of my favorite letters. One is from suburban Maple Heights, and the other will be from inside of the city. And I'm going to do this for a couple of different reasons. Claudia Mendette is one of the few students who actually talked about the Cuyahoga River. Dear Mr. Stokes, I love these. I loved all of them. I think they're fabulous. If you ever have the inclination, go read them. First of all, they come out of different situations. They serve different purposes for these kids and for the teachers that are teaching them. This particular class, the entire class wrote a letter, and they're all typed. So I can't tell what class it was. It might actually have been an English class. Some kids are writing out of science classes, and some kids are probably just writing in a typing class. Dear Mr. Stokes, stop pollution. It is plain to see that our area is deteriorating at a rapid rate. By 1980, we may all be walking around wearing gas masks in order to breathe. Lake Erie will be a giant sewage dump. In 5th grade, I, now in the 11th grade, had the experience of taking a nauseating ride on the Good Time 2. May I suggest that they change the name of this boat to the Pollution 2? When I took the trip, my fellow classmates and I spent the day watching the Cuyahoga River change colors and smelling how bad the stench could become. This matter should not be put off until future generations. There might not be a future generation if the problem of pollution is not stopped immediately. For the cause of mankind, please do as much as possible to combat this critical situation. Sincerely yours, Claudia Mendet. Isn't that a lovely letter? Even this young woman who mentions the Cuyahoga River doesn't mention that it caught on fire. I think that's meaningful, right? It tells us something about what they're talking about in class. Not everybody in this class wrote about the Cuyahoga River, so I know that the teacher gave them the opportunity to write about something that was meaningful to them. And it was her own experience coming from Maple Heights down into the city. Obviously, she's writing to the mayor of Cleveland, so she wants to mention the city. But what I take from this letter, and it's symbolic of a representative of all of the others from the suburbs that I read, is that she understands that there is an environmental crisis. The crisis is now, language that Stokes himself used quite often and language that a lot of the students repeated. But the crisis is there. The crisis is in the city. Let me read another letter. This one from inside of the city. This is from St. Wendelin's, and this is the most heartbreaking of the letters that I read. This is from Melissa Stevens. St. Wendelin's, if you don't know, was on the very near west side, and I guess you would call it Ohio City, right near there on Columbus. Mr. Stokes. She also was in part of a class. There are a whole bunch of letters from St. Wendelin's. I am writing to you because I and others have a problem, which I think you can help us solve. Willie Hill on Willie Street is a dump. It has garbage and filth all around it. It involves danger. There are also rats down there. I am writing to you so that you will please have someone to come and clean the mess. It really doesn't give a good impression of St. Wendelin's school, to which I go. If you have it cleaned, I promise I will do what I can to keep it that way. It should look like God wanted it to be. Thank you. It makes me cry every time I read it. What's remarkable about Melissa Stevens and the other people who write from the city, there's also a school, the Daniel Morgan School in Huff, they all write. They write about problems. They understand that there's a crisis. The environmental crisis doesn't seem to take on any particular urgency, but the crisis is here, right? It's completely underfoot. It isn't the pollution that's at some distance. It isn't some experience that they have while riding in the car. It isn't air pollution that they can see when they come downtown or smell when they come downtown. It's what they experience in their daily lives. It's the rats and the broken glass and the stray dogs. But it is, I think, an environmental crisis nonetheless, and that is the way that Carl Stokes conceived of the problem, that all of these things were interconnected. The problem of housing and sanitation and rat control were all very much intertwined with the problem of water and air pollution. And all of them were intertwined with the problem of power and the fact that he simply did not have the power to solve the problems that he saw. So let me turn to that book, The Promises of Power, and read to you a couple of my favorite assessments. He obviously spent 2 terms as mayor, 4 years, and he leaves having not accomplished what he had set out to do, and so there's a good bit of disappointment that drips through the entire book. As mayor, you were in control of territorial boundaries, but you have nothing with which to sustain yourself. You cannot look to the people in the central city, for they have more needs than they have resources, and that was a problem that was only getting worse. And then I just love this summation of the problem of metropolitan America. It's not a problem that was Cleveland's itself. You cannot look to the people in the suburbs because that is why they are out there. You cannot look to the state because the legislature is controlled by a suburban rural coalition. Stokes' only hope, and he leaned on it quite a bit while he was mayor, was to get the federal government involved. And in fact, this is why I have issue with Jonathan Adler's conclusions about libertarianism and the fact that the river would have been cleaned eventually somehow. The involvement of the federal government was absolutely essential to solving the problems of Cleveland because Cleveland was not in a position to do it by itself because of the way metropolitan America was established. So I mentioned that Stokes did not mention the Cuyahoga River catching fire in his reminiscence of his 4 years in office, but he did mention one event that took place in the same month as the fire. So this is after he had been in office for about a year and a half. This is June of 1969. And I just want to read to you my brothers and our kind of use of this story as it appears in the book. Stokes described the damnedest period in his life, which began with the death of Donald Waite, a young white man stabbed by a black man down the hill from Stokes' home. Incensed, many of the neighborhood's white residents took to the streets. Stokes drove to the scene to beg for calm, and after a tense confrontation with the dead man's father, Stokes climbed into his car and headed home up Woodland Avenue. There's his home. There he found his darkened house encircled by police cars and officers carrying shotguns. They had been given word that the crowd was marching up the hill. An officer asked the mayor to join his family inside, keep the lights off, and get on the floor. His wife Shirley, 6 months pregnant, lay on the floor upstairs with their 2 frightened and confused children. Stokes sat downstairs in the dark, listening to the screech of walkie-talkies outside and the ruckus of the approaching crowd. A committee of my neighbors, Stokes called them, numbering as many as 200. The police used tear gas to halt the crowd. Quote, "The yard is filled with police to protect me," Stokes wrote later, "not from some foreign enemy, but from a mob of people who live 20 blocks away from me." That night, sitting besieged in his own house, Stokes had no illusions about the power he held as a black mayor of a white city. Here was a city badly in need of change, and the man who might force it through, both of them trapped and powerless. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to answering your questions.
I am Jerry Meyer, a proud City Club member and active on the program committee. And today at our Friday forum, we are listening to Dr. David Stradling, Associate Dean of Humanities and Professor of History at the McMicken College of Arts and Sciences at the University of Cincinnati, and co-author of Where the River Burned, Carl Stokes and the Struggle to Save Cleveland. We're about to begin the audience Q&A. We welcome questions from everyone, City Club members, guests, students, and those of you joining us via our radio broadcast, webcast, or our new live simulcast sites, the Parma Snow branch of the Cuyahoga Public Library and the East Lake Public Library. The Lake County broadcast is supported by the Lakeland Foundation. If you'd like to tweet a question, please tweet it at the City Club, and our staff will try to work it into the program. We want to remind you that questions should be brief and to the point. Holding the microphones today are Content Coordinator Teddy Eisenberg over here on the right, and Marketing and Outreach Coordinator Faye Walker on the left. May we have the first question? Please signal the microphone holders to ask a question.
Hi. The new elected president does not believe in global warming and what's really going on. My question is how detrimental ignoring this problem for the next 4 years it's going to be to the world.
Very. What I find interesting is that, let me relate it to the larger problems that Stokes was dealing with. The other thing that's remarkable about reading his materials is that they seem like they could have been written today. And even just reading the newspapers, I mean, there's some stylistic changes, but with Carl Stokes, there aren't even stylistic differences. You literally could think that he was writing about this moment. And part of it is obviously that race relations are just as tense and fraught as they were at that moment, although we speak of them a little differently, that the problems of the division in the city of the poor and the wealthy are just as evident. And the environmental crisis, although the specifics have changed, it persists. And the Cuyahoga is much, much cleaner now, thanks to the very, very hard work of lots of dedicated people, both in politics and in public service. Obviously, it's going to take that kind of dedication to the work of shifting our energy usage to solve the problems of climate change, but that's a topic about which I'm not an expert.
Over here. I share your sense as a historian that when you went back, it was a disappointment to find that the fire that still burns in our memory didn't burn as large at the moment. But it does touch on the power of a compelling image to mobilize people even 50 years later. And water, which is to some degree our special theme today, is a hazardous resource in that it's so bland and quiet and sits out there and doesn't do much most of the time. Do you have any current metaphor or compelling image or great story that resonates for you, that's more recent, and that in some way has some of the same power to stir action to try to protect the riverways and the lakes that we care about?
That's an interesting question, and I share your sense that it is very important to have an imagery that is moving, and that's one of the reasons why I think people are perfectly fine continuing to use the photograph of 1952 instead of the much less interesting photographs from 1969. And quite frankly, I'm not such a stickler for those kinds of things, but I must say that we have entered an age of maybe even beyond truthiness, where one does not have to say the truth at all to be heard. And so I think that there are things that we need to correct when we hear something that's wrong. Now, as far as the imagery is concerned, because the purpose of finding an image is political in and of itself, I think you always wind up with something that's problematic. And every time we try to unravel one of those images, for example, polar bears sitting on melting ice floes, you find a more complicated story behind it. And as much as, in the constantly marketing world that we live in, imagery is necessary. We have a very, very visual culture. I'm a words guy myself. And I still believe, and in fact, this is one of the things that Carl Stokes had in common with President Obama. His words were remarkably powerful. And I still believe that we have the ability to assemble words in such a way as to move action.
Hi, thanks. I wonder, you made a comment about Carl Stokes and being relatively powerless in terms of the dynamic between the state and the suburbs and exurbs, and analogized to today. But today we have an international climate that's also putting pressure on the global movement, and it's impacting in the United States. So I wonder if you could kind of draw the connection between Carl Stokes and the global perspective. Was that present in that time as well?
Right. In his day, the problem was, and thank you for the question, in his day, the problem was trying to create regional problem-solving entities. And the regional sewer district is the result of one of those, trying to figure out how to create regional air pollution standards, those kinds of things. That gives you a sense of how the thinking was expanding. When one gets concerned about Lake Erie, one can't be concerned just about what's in Lake Erie, but what's draining into Lake Erie. That's how ecological thinking has you moving farther and farther out. And now is obviously the solutions must be global. And that's a very difficult conversation to have, especially at a moment where nationalism has resurfaced, not just in the United States, but around the world. Our concern about a globalizing economy may get in the way of creating a globalized regulation of energy consumption and production. And I simply am not capable of suggesting how that moves forward, except for these are long conversations that we'll absolutely have to have.
Do you think global warming is going to get worse over the next 10 years?
Going to get worse?
Yes.
Yes. Although I was thinking, I had a lovely walk this morning. It's never cloudy in Cleveland when I come here. There are benefits to drought, and one of them is that you don't see clouds, right? So I had a lovely walk down to the lake, and I was reminded once again that some places will be devastated by global warming and other places will benefit. I think you guys are lucky. Invest in concrete companies and steel, because we're going to need a lot of those products to, gird ourselves to rising seas, and Cleveland will benefit over the long term because there will be climate refugees, and there are some places that will retain water, and there are some places that will be underwater, and Cleveland will have water resources.
You may have touched on this, that I missed it, but why do you think the Cuyahoga River burning has been so entrenched in the narrative of Cleveland? You still can't read a newspaper article without the lead being the city that the river burned, and 50, 60 years ago it happened. So why do you think it's just become so entrenched in our pop culture narrative?
I think there are two different answers there. One is, why do Clevelanders talk about it so much? And part of the reason why they do is because they drink the beer. But part of it also speaks to, and this is what I love about the image. You should go back to your old packaging, because that image on the pale ale, with the photograph of the city with the river in the foreground, that just, and what's obviously not a river fire, but a very nice, clean burning in the foreground, it speaks to a moment that Clevelanders, I think, are actually rather proud of. This is a city that made things. And if the river had to catch on fire every now and then, so be it. It was, it is in some ways, what I like about that is taking control of the story, right? That this is a city that was that grew rapidly and made lots of things that were of use to the nation, and this is part of who we are. And so I see no problem of controlling the narrative in that way, and actually kind of celebrating that aspect of the industrial past of Cleveland, even if the image itself is of post-industrial downtown. Then there's the story that comes from outside, which I think just comes from laziness. That, that people in New York, when they want to do a story because they're coming here for the World Series or because they're doing a story about LeBron, the lazy thing is just to say the 2 or 3 things that you know about Cleveland already. So that's this is and I say these things in part because I think they both pertain to the city that I live into, Cincinnati, that we have this kind of love-hate relationship with our own past, and that we are often kind of mischaracterized by the coasts, which also is a story that came out in the election.
Hi. I think I'd like you to comment on something. One of the things that made the Clean Water Act possible was that there was such a thing at that time known as environmentally concerned Republicans. Mm-hmm. In that what you had was an ability to form alliances across the parties to actually push it, and who, for the love of God, was the president at that time but Richard Nixon.
Right.
And I just wondered if you could comment on just how things have changed since then, to the point where we really need a new whole environmental set of policies, but fat chance that it's going to get through just complete intransigence,
Right.
particularly for one party.
That's a good question, too, and I guess I should have anticipated that everybody would want to talk about the now rather than the past. But quite frankly, I love to take refuge in the past. That's one of the advantages of being a historian, is that you can simply crawl into the library and say, well, I understand that there were problems, but some of these problems got solved. And I must say that although many of the most serious problems never did get solved, and who knows if they ever will, particularly about racial and economic inequality. But some of the discrete problems got solved. And you're absolutely right that it was a bipartisan effort in the 1960s and 1970s. And as much as it may seem like that's not possible now, Richard Nixon was not a lover of the environment, really. He was a pragmatic politician. He did these things because people told him he had to. And that's the power of democracy. You just keep saying these things until the people in power respond. And this is, I was talking to Lauren about this last night, this was the gift of both of the Stokes brothers, is that they understood that you needed to work through the system, right? That you have to be able to talk to the people who had power. You had to exert as much power as you had yourself, and you had to keep at it. And they both did that, Lou particularly, for a very, very long time, right? You know that you're not going to win every day, but if you stick to it, you win enough.
My question is a historian question,
Yay.
so I'll take you to the past. But since the beginning of time, clean water was tied into poverty, and often poor still, and to this day, poor nations do not have access to clean water. Is that something that we're looking at now? And then, going back in history, how have these problems been solved in the past? And which way should we go? What should we do to keep clean water for all Americans in this time?
Yeah. So your history question very quickly morphed into. So I will note that there are always, in environmental problems, there are always two different arenas. One is political, which is what I focused on largely. You have to get to the point where people realize that there's a problem that needs to be solved. And then the other is an engineering issue. How do you actually physically solve the problem? And sometimes you get to a point where there's a long dialogue between those two arenas. That the political arena suggests there's a problem that needs to be solved in the engineering community. What engineering broadly defined community pushes back and suggests that this is the only way that we can do this, and then the political arena suggests there must be another way. A lot of the infrastructure that was built in that first generation of dealing with water pollution in the United States and thereby protecting clean water, a lot of that infrastructure is now old and needs to be replaced. Obviously we saw that in Flint, and we're dealing with it in Cleveland and Cincinnati too. Both of our cities have combined sewer issues that have been long-standing. So I think the engineers know how to solve the problem. What they need is the money to do it, and that requires the political solution, right? And that's where the activism comes in.
The story that you've told today really sounds like it could have been written today. And so looking back, of course, the river does no longer burn, so something good has happened.
Yeah.
What do you see as the main take-home lesson from that story of the past that is useful for today in addressing our environmental problems, especially of water?
Mm-hmm. That's also a very good question. I mean, our take-home lessons were largely around Stokes himself and his vision and his connecting all of these various problems in a way that very, very few people did at the time. As far as actually cleaning the environment, my take-home lesson is the same for that moment as it is for any, is that the communities that have access to power tend to have environmental amenities. Those communities that don't have access to power tend to suffer disproportionately from environmental problems. Anybody who's an environmental activist needs to keep that first and foremost in their mind, because to solve the environmental problems for one group, but to leave others out, whether it be a racial or economic or a geographical group, is to not keep in mind the primary lesson of ecology, which is everything is connected. We can't solve the environmental problems for some people and leave others unsolved. And I think that was at the heart of your question too about clean water around the world, is that we simply can't be content with our own clean water. Right?
Oh, okay. I think this is actually also truly a historical question. So, the fire that we talk about here in Cleveland, I'm like, okay, trying to stand up straight, was by no means the first fire. We know this just in Cleveland, but it was, there were fires that were taking place in other parts of the country for many years prior to this particular fire that we commemorate. And I was wondering if you could touch on why, again, you think this one was so iconic. Was it, did it have to do with the spotlight that Mayor Stokes tried to put on it? Was it, what was it also going on in history that this one became so, so entrenched in our history?
That's actually the question that guided our research for a long time. We were trying to figure out why it is that this particular fire is the one that everybody focuses on, and not just in Cleveland, obviously. Part of that has to do with lastness. This was the last fire. Part of it also has to do with the moment that it happens, right at the moment where, not that people were realizing that America was polluted, but realizing that if they wanted it to be clean, they had to do something about it. So the fact that this fire happened as the environmental movement was really gathering momentum, I think matters. It is also, like I said in the talk, it really is very easy to understand that rivers should not be catching fire, right? I mean, as you were saying, it's such a powerful image. And it is almost biblical, right? I mean, when you get down to the details of it, it's really not all that exciting that, a bunch of driftwood raises up and it's been soaking in oil slick and a train goes over the trestle and a spark catches on fire. That's not very biblical. But the image of flames running across the water, that is. And so I think that there's something particular about the elements, all of the elements coming together in the story, literally the physical elements of the story, and the moment that it happens, and that it's last. And that Lou Stokes, actually, in Congress, wanted to shake the Congress into giving resources to Cleveland, and so made it the centerpiece of his ask for money to study the problems of the Cuyahoga, and I think really publicized this event and made it so that scholars in studying water pollution would find it easily. It's funny that it still does appear most of the time when the Cuyahoga River fire gets mentioned, it truly is just a mention. It seems to be one of those things that doesn't need a lot of explanation, right? You just say the river caught fire, and you're supposed to take from that all of this meaning. You're supposed to be equipped to be able to tell that this is a problem that people needed to solve. And that's what made it so remarkably politically useful.
My question is how would you correlate the toxic algae blooms that we've seen in the Western Erie, both the problem and the potential political hurdles to a solution and solutions?
Yeah.
How would you correlate that to the problems that we saw with the pollution of the Cuyahoga?
Right. That's also a very good question. I'll note that in Cleveland at the time, and this is one of the reasons why the kids were not writing about the Cuyahoga River, they were worried about water pollution, but they were more worried about Lake Erie than they were about the Cuyahoga. And I think largely that had to do with the fact that most Clevelanders at that point did not have a personal connection to the Cuyahoga. As you know, it's difficult to see the Cuyahoga from any place in Cleveland unless you're right on top of it. And very few people at that point were, right? The flats didn't have anything in it except for a lot of piles of gravel and some underutilized industrial space, and occasionally the good time too, I guess. But most people in Cleveland obviously had a connection to Lake Erie. They either saw it or went out on it, wanted to swim in it, wanted to fish in it. And so the deterioration of Lake Erie played a very prominent role in the language of environmentalism in the late 1960s and early 1970s. And that's how we start moving up the Cuyahoga, is that people recognize that it is one of the major contributors of pollution into the lake, but by no means the only. And as you may know, in the late 1960s, actually in the mid-1960s, before the river catches fire in '69, there's an awful lot of attention to phosphates going into the lake and to its tributaries, not just from fertilizer, which is the major contributor now to the blooms in the western part of the lake, but from detergents, which at the time had added phosphates to them so that they were more effective. And lo and behold, there was a federal regulatory solution to that problem, which is that you don't put phosphates in detergents. And that turned out to be a technological fix that required a political fix first. The problem today, I think, is much more difficult because it's non-point pollution. Again, I'm not well equipped to answer the question of how that gets done, except for to simply fall back on the arguments about making certain that it stays in the public eye.
It's been said in recent years that college students who choose to major in such soft studies as philosophy and history and so forth are suckers because they are not going to make the kind of money they could have made. These are not highly rewarded professions. And even some public officials have suggested that society we don't need more history majors. We need people who know how to handle the technology and all of this wonderful stuff we have to deal with today. Would you like to comment on that?
This is as the Associate Dean of Humanities at UC now, I did not give him this question. But we do ask this question of ourselves all the time because those of us who have studied the humanities our whole lives are really bad at describing to people what's valuable about it because, kind of like the river catching fire, we assume that it is self-evidently valuable, right? That in fact, we can't have an intelligent conversation about policy creation and policy functioning without those soft skills. I'm not a big fan of that particular phrase. Transferable skills, writing and thinking skills, the ability to think imaginatively about the past and the present, to use the one to reflect on the other. All of these things, I think, would be incredibly useful if they were more widely shared by the American population.
Thank you very much, David. Today at the City Club, we have been enjoying a Friday forum with David Stradling, Associate Dean of Humanities and Professor of History at the Mohican College of Arts and Science, University of Cincinnati, and co-author of Where the River Burned, Carl Stokes and the Struggle to Save Cleveland. His brother, Richard Stradling, was the other co-author. Today's forum is the Thomas F. and Marguerite Campbell Forum, made possible by a generous gift from Tom and Peggy Campbell. Peggy and her grandson, Tom, are with us today in the audience. We thank them for their continued support of the City Club. Dr. Stradling also appears as part of our series on the value of water, sponsored by the Northeast Ohio Regional Sewer District. Additional support for today's forum is provided by the Unger Family Foundation and Great Lakes Brewing Company. We are grateful for your support. Our community partner today for today's forum is the Cleveland Water Alliance, and our hospitality partner is the Metropolitan at the 9 Hotel. We thank both of you for your partnership. Additionally, we welcome guests at tables hosted by Cuyahoga Community College, Field Trips for Grown-Ups, Idea Stream, and the Center for Community Solutions. We also welcome many students from MC Squared STEM High School, St. Ignatius High School, and St. Martin de Porres High School at today's forum. Student participation to City Club forums is provided by many foundations, including the Freddie Scholl Charitable Fund. We thank all of you for being here today, students. The sale of Dr. Stradling's book, Where the River Burned, Carl Stokes and the Struggle to Save Cleveland, is available or provided through a cultural exchange. And that brings us to the end of today's forum. Thank you, Dr. Stradling, for a great address. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for attending. This forum is now adjourned.
For information on upcoming speakers or for podcasts of the City Club, go to cityclub.org.
Production and distribution of City Club forums on IdeaStream are made possible by the generous support of PNC and the Raskin Family Fund, with additional funding from Cleveland State University, Robert Conrad, and the Payne Fund.